Today I want to talk about subject and object relative pronouns in adjective clauses. Now we use adjective clauses as complete clauses to modify a noun. I have a more basic video on adjective clauses and one on subject and object relative pronouns in adjective clauses, but in this video we're going to focus on some longer sentences in a longer text to figure out subject and object relative pronoun in a little bit more difficult context. So that's what we're going to focus on today. The text that we're using is adapted from the Blue Azar textbook, and we're going to be looking at examples of adjective clauses in this text. So let's get started. We start out at the beginning. It says, as you know, a computer needs to have an operating system in order to run programs. When most people think about the first operating systems that were developed for the personal computer, Microsoft or Bill Gates may be the first names that you think of. Actually, the truth is somewhat different. In this first paragraph, we have two adjective clauses. Our first one is here, that were developed for the personal computer. This adjective clause is adding information. It's describing the first operating systems. So because these are adjective clauses, they're always modifying a noun. So this adjective clause is modifying the noun, the first operating systems. So let's look at our clause. That were developed for the personal computer. Our relative pronoun in this clause is just the word that. Our relative pronouns are usually that, or which, or who, or a variety of other WH words. So now our goal is to figure out if this relative pronoun that is the subject or object of this clause. Because we know that all clauses have a subject, and it's valuable to know whether this relative pronoun is the subject or object of the clause. So for me, the super easiest way to figure out if it's subject or object is to read the clause and look for another subject. So in this clause, that were developed for the personal computer. Our verb is were developed, the passive voice, and I don't see a subject for that verb. So the subject of the clause is the relative pronoun that. You can also try to imagine this clause as its own complete sentence and try to figure out what the word that is replacing. Relative pronouns are pronouns, so they're always replacing some other noun. In this case, if we made just this adjective clause into its own sentence, we would probably say the first operating systems were developed for the personal computer. So this is replacing the first operating systems, and it is the subject of the clause. All right, let's look at the next example, and as we practice, this will get a little bit easier. It says, Microsoft or Bill Gates may be the first names that you think of. Now, this adjective clause, again, is modifying a noun. It's modifying the noun, the first names. The first names that you think of. Again, our first trick is to look for the subject and verb of the clause. The verb is think, and the subject of this clause is you. So that means that, the relative pronoun, has to be the object of the clause. Now we can also see this with our second strategy, where we try to reform this clause as its own independent sentence. We would say, you think of the first names. That means this word that is replacing first names. Okay? You think of the first names. Okay? So because this is replacing that object of that independent sentence, that means it's an object relative pronoun. All right, let's read our next paragraph. In the late 1970s, there was a man in Seattle named Tim Patterson who worked for a company that was called Seattle Computer. He was a computer programmer and needed an operating system for his computer. Patterson got tired of waiting for another company to create one and decided to develop his own program. He called it QDOS, which meant Quick and Dirty Operating System. As a side note, quick and dirty is a phrase that means something was made very quickly and maybe it's not perfect, but you just made it really quickly to get it done. It took him about 4 months to develop it, which is fast in this type of development. All right, so we have 3 adjective clauses in this paragraph. Our first one is, who worked for a company. This adjective clause is modifying the noun Tim Patterson. So let's look for our relative pronoun who and figure out if it's subject or object. When we look at the whole adjective clause, who worked for a company, we have verb, worked, and what is the subject of that verb? There isn't an obvious subject for the verb, so that one, the subject is going to be who. This replaces Tim Patterson. Tim Patterson worked for a company. That's the subject. And then we have an adjective clause right after it that was called Seattle Computer. This adjective clause is modifying a company. And our relative pronoun, that, is either going to be subject or object of the clause. Let's look. We've got another passive verb, was called, and I don't see an obvious subject for this verb. So we're going to say that is the subject of this clause. So both of these ones, who in this case and that in this case, are both the subjects of the relative clauses or the adjective clauses. Let's look down here. This adjective clause, which meant quick and dirty operating system, is describing or giving more information about QDOS. So we're looking at our relative pronoun which, trying to figure out if it's subject or object of the clause. Again, we find the verb, meant, and we look for the subject of that verb. We don't see an obvious subject, so we know that which is the subject of the clause. We can also imagine replacing the relative pronoun with this noun, and it says QDOS meant quick and dirty operating system, and QDOS is the subject of that independent sentence. All right, now we're down to our last paragraph. At the same time, Microsoft was quietly looking for an operating system to run a personal computer that IBM was developing. Microsoft saw the program that Patterson had written and in 1980 paid him $25,000 for a license for DOS. A year later, they paid another $50,000 to acquire the rights. It became known as the Microsoft Disk Operating System, or MS-DOS, and the rest is history. Microsoft became very successful using Patterson's operating system. So let's look at these last 2 adjective clauses. We have that IBM was developing. This is modifying the noun. Well, let's look. Is it modifying the noun personal computer? They're looking for an operating system to run a personal computer that IBM was developing. So our subject here is was developing. Another, this is a past progressive verb. And we're looking for a subject. The subject of this verb is the company IBM. So we know that our relative pronoun, that is actually the object of this clause. If we rewrite the sentence comes out as IBM was developing a personal computer. So that relative pronoun is replacing the object of the independent sentence, so it's the object of the clause. All right, and our last example, that Patterson had written. Microsoft saw the program that Patterson had written. So we have our verb, had written, and we look for the subject of that verb. Subject of this verb is Patterson. Patterson had written the program. So if we have our subject here, we know that this is our object of the clause. The relative pronoun is the object of the clause. And we know that it replaces the noun, the program. Patterson had written the program. So again, we can see that this relative pronoun is replacing the object of the sentence.